All right, still looking at this map. This is the map of North America after the end of the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War, with France losing her colonies in North America. And all this pink area being former French territory, now taken over by the English. Well, two issues exist here. Number one, the 13 English colonies along the Atlantic coast down there. The colonists there had been wanting for some time to cross over the Appalachian Mountains and get into that Ohio country that was controlled by the French and their native allies. So the colonists assume that they're now going to be able to do that. And I said they really wanted to. Well, that's really what started this war, if you recall. So that's one issue. The other issue is there are a whole lot of American Indians living in that area. Remember, it was called the French and Indian War. The French pulled out. The French abandoned their forts and abandoned all their military installations and withdrew. The Indians didn't withdraw. They had no place to withdraw to if they wanted to, and they didn't want to. This was actually their homeland. So what's going to happen with them? Now, this division of territory came about at the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Now, we're going to mention several different treaties of Paris over the course of looking at U.S. history. Whenever there's a place to meet and get together and try to figure out a treaty, Paris seems like a good place to do it because, it's Paris, right? It's kind of the same reason that the Southern History Association meets so often in New Orleans. Anyway, this was decided at the Treaty of Paris. That's where Spain was given the former French possession of Louisiana. But when they were having these meetings between all the principal actors involved, how many Native Americans do you think were at the Treaty of Paris? Well, none. And yet it was their homeland that was being discussed, the future of their homeland. So the tribes who lived there, particularly in the northern half of that pink section, most of which were Algonquin language tribes, felt betrayed by their French allies. They had cast their lot with the French, and they had fought beside them, and the French lost, and the Indians lost. And now the French have signed away all this territory, which the Indians, of course, didn't acknowledge as belonging to France anyway. They considered it their territory. But there were also a lot of treaty obligations, a lot of promises that France had made that now are meaningless. Plus, the French signed away that land to the English. Again, no Indians were there. So the British come in and take over. The British occupy the empty French forts. Now, having, as part of the whole peace negotiation, assumed all the obligations of the French, the British are now the ones with whom those Indians are going to have to deal. The French had treated the Indians as allies, maybe junior partners, but still partners. The British treat them like conquered victims, and they change all the wording on the agreements. They shortchange the Indians from what they were used to getting from the French. They, among other things, refuse to any further sell guns or gunpowder or ammunition to those Indian tribes. And looking at it from the British perspective, well, these Indians were shooting at them last week. But looking at it from the Native American perspective, they had become completely reliant on guns. No longer, many of them, as adept at using bows and arrows as they had once been. And so they have guns. They need guns for hunting and for defense. If nothing else, against their other Native American enemies. And they don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the capability to produce their own. So that puts them in a bad way. And it makes all the Indians in the Ohio country, that whole area, the whole Great Lakes area, very resentful toward the English. And they would have been resentful toward them already just because they had lost the war. But now, how they were being treated in their defeat really, really rankled them. So, let's see what happens. And it happens pretty quickly. It happens even, it gets started even before that treaty is signed. This story begins with a member of the Delaware tribe, also known as the Lenni Lenape tribe. And this is their home area, kind of spread out there. Although if you look at the little box up there on the left, you can see it's just sort of there where Pennsylvania, New York, and Connecticut come together, and all of New Jersey and Delaware, not surprisingly. So that's their home territory, but many of them had been pushed away from that region and pushed westward. So by the mid-1700s, there were quite a few living in what is now Ohio. And later, by the way, they would be removed from there and sent to Oklahoma in the 1800s. But be that as it may, this is the individual in question, Neolin, also known as the Delaware Prophet. Neolin was a Delaware shaman, Delaware medicine man, and he received a vision from the heavens that gave him the answer to all his people's problems. And this is going to be pretty significant because Neolin's vision and what comes from it is kind of a template that is going to be repeated many times in Native American history over about the next 130 years. But this is the first time that this happened. What is it that I'm talking about? What happened? His vision, essentially from the Great Spirit, saying that the native people needed to go back to their traditional ways, that the reason they had suffered so much loss, the reason they had lost so many of their lands, the reason they were suffering now was because they had displeased the heavens by abandoning the way that they were supposed to do things and instead doing things the way white people do. So the vision said, stop doing that, particularly alcohol. Stay away from alcohol, but stay away from all these things that mark your culture as being changed by the Europeans. And if you do that, he was told, then you will once again have the favor of the spirit world, and you will be able to regain all that you lost. Well, that is a message of hope, particularly for these native peoples who, at the end of the French and Indian War, particularly since so many native tribes throughout the whole area were Algonquin and were allied with the French, really were in a bad spot. So, of course, they're going to respond well to this positive message. And Neolin began to gain followers. He started a spiritual movement that spread beyond just his own tribe. It spread into really all the tribes of the Great Lakes region. And people began to follow his vision. And one of the people who began to follow Neolin's vision was this guy, an Ottawa leader named Pontiac. And yes, Pontiac was from Michigan, from the region that the French had called Pays d'en haut, or the upper country. He was a Youper. Anyway, Pontiac wasn't the sole leader of this movement, this military movement that arose from the spiritual movement. He was the most prominent, though. So several different tribes from that region came together in a loose confederation, all of them inspired by Neolin's vision that they needed to return to their traditional roots, and they'd be able to get their land back. This is what's called a pan-Indian movement. That is, it's across different tribes. And this was one of the first really big pan-Indian movements. Well, Pontiac was extremely persuasive, as a good Native American leader is. And he got a lot of people to come over to his side and decide to actually take action and enact that vision. And so they started a mass attack against the English forts in the Great Lakes region, beginning with Fort Detroit. This is known as, was known for a long time as Pontiac's Rebellion. Again, this is a case where that word may not be entirely appropriate, because rebellion implies that they were rebelling against a proper authority. Historians now are more likely to refer to it as Pontiac's War. And it was a pretty big war, and the first part of it, the Indians did pretty well. In fact, this map shows all the forts in the region. And then the X's are battles that were fought other than attacks on forts. And all the little fire symbols are forts that were destroyed. The others were forts that managed to hold off the native attackers, including Fort Pitt. And some of them, too, were just outright abandoned by the English because they knew they wouldn't be able to hold them. Well, the war lasted from 1763 officially till 1766. That's when the treaty was signed. But the fighting itself took place mostly over the course of a year, 63 and well into 1864. And then finally the English got the upper hand, and then the native peoples withdrew from their attacks. Now, a really sordid and tragic incident occurred in Pennsylvania during this war, Pontiac's War, about halfway through the war. I think it was December of 1763. So Pennsylvania, let's take a look at that map there, and you can see Pennsylvania. Where is that? That's right next to Ohio. That's where it is. So the colonists living in Pennsylvania had just gone through a long, grueling war against the French and their Indian allies, and the war had just ended when another war with the Indians starts right on the heels of it. And a lot of these folks in Pennsylvania had either fought in that war or had lost people, maybe even civilians during the various attacks. And they had very negative opinions, many of them, on Indians in general. So kind of like what happened in Salem, Massachusetts back in the 1690s, there's a bit of mass hysteria here. And mass hysteria, as you may know, can often lead to mob action. And that's what happened beginning in the Pennsylvania town of Paxton. Now, there was a group of Indians. They were Conestoga Indians. You probably are not familiar with that word unless you watch a lot of old westerns. The old covered wagons that headed west were called Conestoga wagons because this is where they were made. So Conestoga Indians, a peaceful group of Indians who had all converted to Christianity. And had not been involved. They hadn't been involved in Pontiac's rebellion/war. They hadn't been involved in the war with the French. They had stayed neutral and been peaceful because that's kind of how they rolled after converting to Christianity. So a lot of angry people in Paxton who referred to themselves as the Paxton Boys were upset about all these forts being attacked not too far away. And so they decided that it was time to take matters in hand and kill some Indians. Problem was, the hostile Indians were a good ways distant. Plus, also the hostile Indians had guns and stuff. And so this mob knew where there were some Indians close at hand, the Christian Conestoga Indians. And so they descended upon the Conestoga Indians and slaughtered them. They massacred them. And that did not make them step back and say, oh, maybe we overreacted. It inflamed their bloodlust, and they decided that they wanted to kill more Indians. Now, if they really wanted to kill Indians, they could have just kept marching west toward where the hostile Indians were. But they didn't do that. They wanted to kill, they kind of enjoyed, I guess, the relative ease with which they were able to kill these Indians. So there were a lot of other peaceful Indians in Pennsylvania. Remember, the Quakers, under William Penn, from the very beginning of the establishment of the colony, had tried real hard to develop good relationships with the local native tribes, and had been very friendly and fair dealing with them. But at this point, those days are over. So what the Paxton Boys decide to do is they march toward where those other peaceful Indians are, who got word that they were coming. And so these various Indian groups retreated to the city of Philadelphia seeking protection. And the Paxton Boys, whose number was growing as they marched along through other towns and other people joined them, marched right up to Philadelphia with the intention of coming in and killing all the Indians seeking refuge there, whether anyone who lived in Philadelphia wanted them to do that or not. And people who lived in Philadelphia did not. In fact, the town fathers of the city gathered together a militia and went outside outside the city to head off the Paxton Boys coming to kill the Indians. And one of the town fathers who had organized this militia stepped forward to speak to them. He was a man we've already briefly met once, named Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin stepped forward and spoke to the mob, and essentially he gave this speech where he said that it was wrong to seek revenge for things that other Indians had done to you by attacking and killing peaceful Indians. He said, it would be like if a person with red hair killed my family. Would that give me the right to go out and kill every red-haired person I ever saw? No. And he was very persuasive, and he was able to talk down the mob, and they just sort of scattered and went home, and the Indians who had sought refuge in Philadelphia were safe. Well, what all this demonstrates is the degree of anti-Indian sentiment that existed in the colonies. Even in a place like Pennsylvania that had been renowned as probably being the best colony so far as dealing with Indians. Although it wasn't universal, right? Because the people of Philadelphia stood up to the mob. All right. Well, one more thing to mention here, and that's the outcome of what happens to those trans-Appalachian lands on the other side of those mountains that the colonists had wanted desperately to settle, but they couldn't because the French and the Indians had this nasty habit of attacking them when they tried. Now, England is in control of all of that, so it's open season, right? And people can just go pouring in there and claim their lands in the Ohio Valley and farther south, right? Well, that's what they thought, but that's not what happened. The Proclamation of 1763 was a British law that established a line called the Proclamation Line. And that line, essentially, was the Appalachian mountain chain from, all the way up in Maine, all the way down to northern Georgia. Parliament decided that was the furthest western boundary of the 13 colonies, and English colonists were not allowed to go beyond that line. The land beyond that line was designated an Indian reserve. That is, it's set aside for the Indians. It's Indian country. Well, you can imagine how that made the colonists feel. Remember how that whole Bacon's Rebellion thing had gone. Why did Parliament do that? Well, I'll tell you why. Now, the colonists, they were looking toward their own immediate self-interests, right? Parliament had to take a much broader view. Britain had a global, it was growing into a global empire. They had colonies all over the world. They had some colonies in South America even. They had colonies in Asia. They had colonies in Africa. They had colonies in India. They had colonies in the Middle East. And they're having to stay on top of all that. And they just fought this war against the French. That was a global war. It wasn't confined to North America. And that war was pretty expensive. England didn't want to have to keep spending money to keep building forts and keep sending more British soldiers to protect these colonists from the Indians that the colonists kept riling up by invading their lands. That was getting expensive, right? This big war was caused by George Washington's little incursion into Ohio. And beyond that, the British wanted these tribes, kind of like the governor of the Virginia colony back there in the 1600s. They wanted these Indian tribes to be autonomous because they wanted them as allies. They wanted them as trade partners. And all of that would be ruined if colonists from these 13 colonies can just go streaming in there whenever they want and just take land away from the Indians. So the colonists discovered that essentially their own government was preventing them from expanding westward, which was what they were just desperately itching to do, to get a hold of more land. And again, looking at it from the point of view of the average people in these colonies, a lot of whom were poor, that was the opportunity. That was the way to improve your condition in life. This is setting things up for some friction and some resentment. And spoiler alert, the colonists don't obey that law. They find ways. They find ways to get into that interior Trans-Appalachian area, and that's going to lead to some problems. So, a real brief summary of the conclusion of the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, which was basically concurrent with the end of that war. It bolstered the idea of pan-Indian identity, and that's important because you had a lot of American Indian tribes cooperating with one another in new and different ways. Just one example we talked about earlier, the Iroquois and the Cherokee were traditional enemies, yet they both allied with the English at the beginning of that war and worked together. And then you got all of these Algonquin language tribes in the Ohio region working together. So that created unity among Indians. It also, among the English colonists, did two different things at once. It bolstered their sense of colonial identity, like distinct frontier American identity as opposed to English, because they had this unique experience. And at the same time, remember, there was more and more of a feeling of sort of British superiority to other Europeans going on around this time. And that was bolstered among the English colonists. So they're happy to be unique and distinct from the other English people, but at the same time, they're really happy to be English people because English people rock. Because look how great they're doing. So it could have gone either way so far as the colonists go, what would happen next. But it went a particular way, as we will see.